There is a tomb in the Western Valley of the Kings. Not the main valley, not the famous valley where the tourists walk and the guides point and the golden mask of Tutankhamun was found in 1922, but the quieter, emptier, less visited western branch, separated from the main valley by a ridge of limestone and accessible only by a narrow path that winds through the cliffs and the rubble and the silence of a landscape that has not changed in 3,000 years. The tomb is designated WV23. It was first discovered by the Italian explorer Giovanni Belzoni in 1816, 6 years before Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone. More than a century before Howard Carter found Tutankhamun, the tomb was empty when Belzoni found it. The sarcophagus, a red granite box that had once held the mummified body of a pharaoh, had been smashed. Not weathered, not cracked by the passage of time, but deliberately, violently, intentionally destroyed, broken into pieces by human hands wielding hammers or heavy stones, in an act of desecration that was designed not merely to rob the tomb, but to erase the person who lay within it from the realm of the dead. The walls of the tomb had been carved and painted, but the images had been defaced. The cartouches that once contained the pharaoh's name had been chiseled away. The figure of the pharaoh's wife, a woman named Tay, had been hacked from the stone. Every inscription, every image, every trace of the person who was buried in this tomb had been systematically and comprehensively destroyed by someone who wanted the dead king not merely forgotten but obliterated, erased from the afterlife itself, denied the eternal existence that the Egyptian funerary tradition was designed to guarantee. In the theology of ancient Egypt, to destroy a person's name was to destroy their soul. To erase a person's image was to prevent their their life force, from recognizing the body and returning to it. The destruction of the tomb of WV23 was not merely vandalism, not merely theft, not merely the desecration of a sacred space. It was murder, a second murder, committed after death in the realm of the spirit against a man who had already been buried and who was supposed to rest in peace for eternity. The act of destruction was performed with the systematic thoroughness that characterized the Egyptian state's most organized enterprises, the same methodical precision that the Egyptians brought to the construction of temples, the management of irrigation systems, and the administration of an empire. This was not the work of vandals or robbers. It was the work of agents acting under official authority, following orders, executing a policy of deliberate and comprehensive erasure that extended from the physical destruction of the sarcophagus to the careful removal of every hieroglyphic sign that spelled the dead pharaoh's name. The agents knew precisely what they were doing. They were trained, they were supervised, and they understood, with the clarity of professional specialists, the theological implications of their work. In the Egyptian worldview, the destruction of a name was not merely a political act. It was a cosmological one, an intervention in the fabric of reality that affected not merely the historical record of the living world, but the eternal existence of the individual in the realm of the dead. The agents who smashed I's sarcophagus and chiseled his name from the walls of his tomb were not merely vandalizing a grave. They were killing a soul, destroying an identity, and condemning a man to the most terrible fate that the Egyptian theological system could imagine. The second death, the permanent extinction of the individual's existence in both the visible and the invisible worlds. And they did it anyway, because the man who sent them wanted the former occupant of this desecrated and shattered tomb to cease to exist, not merely in the historical record of the living world, but in the eternal realm of the dead. The man who was buried in that shattered sarcophagus, whose name was chiseled from those walls, whose image was hacked from that stone, was named I. He was the pharaoh who followed Tutankhamun, the man who performed the sacred opening of the mouth ceremony on the boy king's mummy, the man who buried Tutankhamun in the golden tomb that would make the boy the most famous pharaoh in history, the man who married Tutankhamun's young widow and placed the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt on his own elderly head, and the man who ruled Egypt for approximately 4 years before dying, an old man, probably in his 70s, exhausted by a lifetime of political maneuvering, and being buried in the tomb in the Western Valley that his successor would then systematically, deliberately, and with the cold precision of a political assassination, destroy. The story of Ai is not a story of triumph. It is a story of the most successful, the most adaptable, and the most historically consequential political career in the history of the ancient world, ending in the most comprehensive, the most systematic, and the most theologically devastating erasure that the pharaonic system had ever inflicted on one of its own rulers. It is the story of a man who spent 50 years accumulating power, and who held the ultimate power for just 4 years before losing everything. Not merely his throne, not merely his legacy, but his afterlife itself, his eternal existence, his soul, destroyed by the chisels and the hammers of the men who came after him, and who wanted the world to believe that I had never existed. The man who survived everything was, in the end, erased by everything. The contrast between A's career and his obscurity is one of the most striking paradoxes in the study of the ancient world. Here is a man who was present at every major event of the late 18th dynasty, who witnessed the Golden Age, served the revolution, managed the restoration, buried the boy king, married the queen, and seized the throne, and who is virtually unknown to the general public. Tutankhamun, the boy who did nothing, is the most famous pharaoh in history. I, the man who did everything, is a footnote. The inversion is complete, and it is a consequence not of the men's respective accomplishments, but of the accidents of archaeological preservation, the contingencies of tomb robbery and tomb survival, and the deliberate, politically motivated politics of historical erasure. I is the most mysterious pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, and one of the most mysterious figures in the entire history of ancient Egypt. He was not born to the throne. He was not the son of a pharaoh or the grandson of a pharaoh. He was a commoner, a man who rose through the ranks of the Egyptian bureaucracy, who accumulated titles and influence across the reigns of at least 3 pharaohs, who navigated the most catastrophic period of theological and political upheaval in the history of the Egyptian state, and who emerged, at the end of it all, as the last man standing, the elderly courtier, the survivor, the pragmatist, the man who had watched pharaohs rise and fall, and who had outlived them all, who placed himself on the throne of the most powerful civilization in the ancient world at a moment when every other claimant was dead, disgraced, or too young to prevent him. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand who I was. Not the shadowy background figure of popular documentaries, not the generic power behind the throne of simplified histories, but the specific, complex, deeply ambiguous, and historically consequential man who witnessed the golden age of Amenhotep III at its most magnificent of Amenhotep III, who served as a senior official during the revolutionary reign of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who may have been the father of the most famous queen in the history of ancient Egypt, who managed the restoration of the traditional gods under the boy king Tutankhamun, who may have been involved in the murder of a Hittite prince who seized the throne of Egypt through a combination of political maneuvering and theological ritual, and who was then erased comprehensively, violently, and almost successfully by the military commander who succeeded him, who wanted the world and the gods to forget that I had ever existed. You are going to understand what the archaeological evidence tells us about the man, what the diplomatic archives reveal about his political maneuvering, and what the shattered sarcophagus and the chiseled walls of his tomb tell us about the price of ambition in a civilization where power extended beyond the grave, and where the destruction of a name was the destruction of a soul. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin together. The man who would become Pharaoh was born, as far as the evidence allows us to determine, in the city of Akhmim in Upper Egypt, sometime in the early 14th century BC. Akhim was a provincial city on the east bank of the Nile, roughly 470 kilometers south of modern Cairo, known primarily as the cult center of the fertility god Min, and as the home of a small but ambitious family of provincial nobles. A family whose members would, over the course of 3 generations, rise from the local priesthood of Min to the highest offices of the Egyptian state. producing queens, military commanders, and ultimately a pharaoh, a trajectory of social ascent and institutional advancement that was remarkable and historically extraordinary even by the standards of the 18th dynasty, a dynasty that had shown itself willing to elevate talented commoners to positions of extraordinary power and influence, who had, through a combination of ability, ambition, and strategic marriage, risen to positions of extraordinary influence at the royal court. The family included a man named Yuya and his wife Chuyu, a couple whose intact tomb was discovered in the Valley of the Kings in 1905 by the American archaeologist Theodore Davis, and whose burial, filled with gilded coffins and elaborate funerary equipment, was considered the greatest archaeological find in Egypt until the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb 17 years later. The tomb of Yuya and Chuyu was, in its own way, as significant as the tomb of Tutankhamun, not because of the gold, though there was gold, but because of the preservation. The mummies of Yuya and Chuyu were among the best preserved ever discovered in Egypt. Their features still recognizable, their wrappings still intact, their faces bearing expressions that seem to look across the millennia with an uncanny and almost unsettling clarity. Scholars who have studied the mummy of Yuya have noted a strong physical resemblance to the surviving carved and painted statuary depictions of Ai. The same broad face, the same prominent nose, the same bone structure, a resemblance that, while not conclusive, is consistent with the hypothesis that the two men were father and son. The family from Akhmim was, in many ways, the most extraordinary non-royal family in the history of the 18th dynasty. From the provincial priesthood of Min, they had produced a queen, Ti, who married Amenhotep III and became one of the most politically powerful women in the ancient world. They had produced a military commander and administrator, Yuya, whose titles reflected authority over both the army and the religious establishment. They had produced, if the identification is correct, the father of Nefertiti, the queen whose painted bust has become the most recognized image of female beauty in the history of human civilization. And they had produced, in A himself, a man who would navigate the most catastrophic period of political and theological upheaval in the history of the Egyptian state, and who would emerge, at the end of it all, as the Pharaoh, the God-King, the divine ruler, the Lord of the two lands. The rise of the Akhmim family is a case study in the dynamics of social mobility in ancient Egypt, a civilization that is often imagined as rigid, hierarchical, and closed to advancement from below, but that was in reality remarkably fluid in its willingness to elevate talented and ambitious individuals from the provincial elite to the highest offices of the state. The Egyptian system rewarded competence, and the family from Akhmim was, by any measure, extraordinarily competent. Yuya held a collection of titles that reflected both military and religious authority: Master of the Horse, Commander of the Chariotry, God's Father, and Priest of Min. His wife Chuyu held the title King's Mother, a title that identified her as the mother of a queen. That queen was Ti, the commoner who had been elevated to the position of Great Royal Wife by Amenhotep III, and who would become one of the most powerful and most politically influential women in the entire history of the pharaonic state. If the identification is correct, and the circumstantial evidence, including shared titles, shared geographic origin, and physical similarities between Yuya's mummy and surviving statuary depictions of Ai, strongly supports it, then Ai was Yuya's son, Tia's brother, Amenhotep III's brother-in-law, and Akhenaten's uncle. The marriage of Tia to Amenhotep III was itself one of the most consequential events in the history of the 18th dynasty. A marriage between a pharaoh and a commoner that broke with the tradition of royal intermarriage, and that elevated a provincial family to the highest level of the Egyptian state. The marriage was announced publicly on a series of commemorative scarabs that Amenhotep III distributed throughout the empire, scarabs that named Tia's parents, Yuya and Chuyu, and that made their non-royal origins a matter of official record rather than a source of shame. The marriage was revolutionary, not in the theological sense that Akhenaten's revolution would be, but in the social sense of demonstrating that the pharaonic system was capable of disrupting its own ancient and venerable conventions, and that the boundaries between the royal family and the non-royal elite were more permeable than the idealized self-image of the dynasty might suggest. The elevation of T, and through T, the elevation of the entire Akhmim family, created the conditions that made I's career possible. Without the marriage of his sister to the pharaoh, I would have remained a provincial noble in Akhmim, a priest of Min, an overseer of cattle, a man of local importance but no national significance, a respected but fundamentally provincial notable whose ambitions would have been limited to the priesthood of Min, the management of the local cattle herds, and the slow, steady, unremarkable, and historically invisible accumulation of local prestige and local influence that constituted the ceiling of realistic achievement for a man of his provincial station in a civilization that, for all its theoretical receptiveness to talent, remained fundamentally hierarchical in its assumptions about the relationship between birth, status, and destiny. With the marriage, I gained access to the royal court, to the patronage networks that connected the provincial elite to the central administration, and to the opportunities for advancement that the pharaonic system offered to talented and ambitious men who knew how to navigate its complexities. The marriage was the gateway, and A walked through it with the quiet confidence, the strategic patience, and the formidable political intelligence that would characterize his entire career. The family from Akhmim had married into the royal house, and the young man from the provincial city was connected, by blood and by marriage, to the most powerful family in the ancient world. I's early career is poorly documented, the sources are fragmentary, and the chronology of his rise through the Egyptian bureaucracy is the subject of scholarly reconstruction rather than documentary certainty. What is clear is that by the time of Akhenaten's reign, I held a collection of titles that placed him at the very center of the Egyptian state. God's father, fan-bearer on the right hand of the king, overseer of all the horses of his majesty, and royal scribe. Each of these titles carried specific responsibilities and specific privileges, and together they describe a man who controlled access to the pharaoh, managed the royal stables and the chariot forces, oversaw the production and preservation of official documents, and occupied a position of such intimate proximity to the person of the king that his influence, personal, political, administrative, and theological, extended into virtually every area of the Egyptian state and into the innermost circle of pharaonic decision-making. The fan-bearer on the right hand of the king was not merely a ceremonial title. It described a man who literally stood beside the pharaoh, who accompanied him in public and in private, who had the ear of the sovereign and the access that comes with physical proximity to power. The overseer of all the horses was not merely a stable master. It was a position of military significance, overseeing the chariot corps that constituted the most technologically advanced and most tactically decisive element of the Egyptian army. The title God's Father, Itnecha in Egyptian, is particularly significant because it is the same title that Yuya had held, and because it has been interpreted by many scholars as meaning father-in-law of the pharaoh. If this interpretation is correct, then A had a daughter who married the pharaoh, and the most likely candidate for that daughter is Nefertiti, the queen whose painted limestone bust has become the most famous portrait in the history of ancient art. The identification of Aya's Nefertiti's father is not proven. No inscription explicitly states the relationship, but the circumstantial evidence is substantial. A's wife Te bore the title Nurse of the Great Royal Wife, a title that connected her directly to the queen's upbringing. The title does not say mother, it says nurse, which has led some scholars to suggest that Te was Nefertiti's stepmother rather than her biological mother, and that Nefertiti may have been the daughter of Ai by an earlier unnamed wife. The question remains unresolved, and it may never be resolved because the documentary sources and the material evidence that would definitively settle the question do not exist, have never been found, and probably never existed in a form that the archaeological record could preserve. What is clear is that I was intimately connected to the royal family, by blood, by marriage, by title, and by the accumulated influence and the institutional authority of decades of faithful and politically skillful service at the highest levels of the Egyptian state. The tomb that I prepared for himself at Amarna, the revolutionary capital that Akhenaten built in the desert, is one of the most important sources of information about his career and about the religious revolution that he served. The tomb, designated Southern Tomb 25, was never completed. I was never buried there because the city of Amarna was abandoned after Akhenaten's death, and the tomb was left unfinished in the cliffs above the empty plain. But the decorated portions of the tomb that were completed contain some of the most important texts and images from the Amarna period, including the only complete surviving copy of the magnificent Great Hymn to the Aten, the magnificent theological poem that is attributed to Akhenaten, and that represents one of the most extraordinary expressions of religious devotion in the literature of the ancient world. The fact that the Great Hymn was inscribed in I's tomb, in the tomb of a courtier, not in the tomb of the pharaoh who composed it, is itself significant because it suggests that I occupied a position of extraordinary theological and political intimacy within the Amarna court, a position that granted him access to the most sacred texts of the revolution and the privilege of having them inscribed on the walls of his own burial chamber. The role of Te, as wife, the woman who bore the important and historically significant title, Nurse of the Great Royal Wife, and who appears alongside I in the Gold of Honor scenes at Amarna, is itself an important element of the story because Te's title connects her directly to Nefertiti and provides one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the hypothesis that I was Nefertiti's father. The title Nurse of the Great Royal Wife does not necessarily mean biological mother. It could mean wet nurse, foster mother, or stepmother, but it does establish a close, intimate, and quasi-parental relationship between Te and the Queen. If Te was Nefertiti's stepmother, if Nefertiti was the daughter of I by an earlier, unnamed wife who had died before the Amarna period, then the family dynamics of the late 18th dynasty become even more complex, even more fascinating, and even more difficult to disentangle from the fragmentary evidence, even more interesting and even more difficult to reconstruct from the fragmentary evidence that has survived. The Amarna tomb also contains scenes showing I and his wife Te receiving the Gold of Honor from Akhenaten and Nefertiti, an elaborate ceremony in which the pharaoh showered golden collars and other precious gifts on favoured courtiers from the window of appearance of the royal palace. The scenes depict I and Te standing beneath the window, their arms raised to catch the golden collars that fall from the pharaoh's hands, their faces turned upward in attitudes of gratitude and devotion. The Gold of Honor ceremony was the most prestigious, the most widely witnessed, and the most politically significant recognition that the Egyptian state could bestow on a non-royal individual, and the fact that I received it is evidence of the extraordinary degree of personal favour and political trust he enjoyed under Akhenaten, a favour that placed him at the very pinnacle of the Amarna court hierarchy and of the central role he played in the administration of the heretic, Pharaoh's revolutionary state. The Gold of Honor ceremony was not merely a reward. It was a public declaration of the Pharaoh's trust, a visible demonstration of the recipient's status, and a political statement about the hierarchy of power within the court. The fact that A received this honor, in a court that was already characterized by paranoia, theological extremism, and the systematic exclusion of anyone who did not fully support the revolution, is evidence that I had mastered the art of political survival in one of the most dangerous environments that the ancient world had ever produced. The question of what I actually believed about the Aten theology is one of the most intriguing and most unanswerable questions in the study of the Amarna period. The Great Hymn to the Aten, the magnificent theological poem inscribed on the walls of I's tomb at Amarna, presents a vision of divine unity, cosmic creativity, and universal care that is one of the most sophisticated expressions of religious thought in the ancient world. Did I believe in this vision? Did he share the pharaoh's conviction that the Aten was the sole creator, the sole sustainer, the sole deity worthy of worship? Or did he merely inscribe the words on his tomb walls because that was what was expected of a courtier who wished to maintain his position in the heretic pharaoh's court? A calculation of political necessity rather than a declaration of theological conviction. The evidence does not allow us to answer with certainty, and the impossibility of answering is itself one of the most historically significant aspects of Ai's career. Because Ai's ambiguity, his ability to serve contradictory theological systems with equal apparent devotion, was not merely a personal characteristic. It was a survival strategy, a mode of political behavior that allowed him to navigate the most dangerous period in the history of the Egyptian state without being destroyed by any of its convulsions. Akhenaten destroyed the traditionalists. Horemheb would destroy the Amarna loyalists. Ai survived both purges, survived because he was, or appeared to be, whatever the current regime needed him to be. Under Akhenaten, he was a devotee of the Aten, inscribing the great hymn on his tomb walls, receiving the gold of honor, holding the highest titles in the revolutionary state. Under Tutankhamun, he was a restorer of Amun, managing the reopening of the temples, supervising the painstaking reconstruction and institutional rehabilitation of the traditional priesthood, overseeing the comprehensive reversal of the revolution he had served. The adaptability was extraordinary, and it raises the question of whether Ai's lack of a fixed theological identity was his greatest weakness or his greatest strength. The answer, from the perspective of political survival, is clear. It was his greatest strength. The men who held fixed positions, the hardline Atenists who could not abandon the revolution, the hardline traditionalists who could not forgive the revolution, were the men who were destroyed by the transitions. Who held no fixed position, who adapted to each new theological environment with the smooth, practiced ease of a professional survivor. A man whose political identity was defined not by what he believed, but by his ability to adapt to whatever the current regime required him to believe, was the man who emerged from every crisis with his power intact and his influence enhanced. The strategy worked for 50 years across 3 reigns, through the most catastrophic period of upheaval in the history of the Egyptian state. It worked right up to the moment when Ai's own successor decided that the strategy had worked too well, and that the man who had survived everything needed to be erased from everything. The impossibility of answering is itself significant, because it reveals the fundamental opacity of the historical record when it comes to the inner lives of the people it documents. We can read the great hymn, we cannot read the mind of the man who inscribed it. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that lies at the heart of the mystery of Ai, and that makes his career one of the most fascinating and most morally ambiguous in the history of the ancient world. Ai served the revolution. He accepted its theology. He inscribed the great hymn to the Aten on the walls of his tomb. He received the gold of honor from the heretic Pharaoh. He held the highest titles in the revolutionary state. And then, when the revolution collapsed, when Akhenaten died, when the boy king Tutankhamun was placed on the throne, when the decision was made to reverse everything that the revolution had accomplished, Ai reversed course with it. He abandoned the theology he had served. He restored the gods whose temples Akhenaten had closed. He managed the comprehensive, systematic, and theologically thorough dismantling of the very revolution that had elevated him to the pinnacle of power, and that had provided the political framework, the institutional structure, and the theological environment within which his entire extraordinary career had been conceived, developed, and brought to fruition. The man who had inscribed the great hymn to the Aten on the walls of his own tomb oversaw the restoration of the temples of Amun, the god whose name the heretic Pharaoh had tried to erase from every surface in the Egyptian empire. The transformation that Ain underwent, from the courtier who inscribed the great hymn to the Aten on his tomb walls to the Pharaoh who restored the temples of Amun, is one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of ancient Egypt. The man who had been, by all outward appearances, a devoted servant of the Aten revolution became, within a few years of the revolution's collapse, the administrator of its comprehensive reversal. The temples that Akhenaten had closed were reopened under Ai's supervision. The priesthood that Akhenaten had disbanded was reconstituted under Ai's authority. The cult statues that Akhenaten had destroyed were replaced under Ai's direction. The restoration stela that Tutankhamun erected at Karnak, the stela that described Egypt's suffering under the Aten Revolution and celebrated the restoration of the traditional gods, was composed and erected under Ai's guidance by a man who had spent the previous 2 decades serving the very revolution that the stela now condemned. Was Ai a true believer who lost his faith, a cynical opportunist who served whatever theology was in power, a pragmatic administrator who understood that the revolution had failed and that survival required adaptation? The evidence does not allow us to answer these questions with certainty, and the inability to answer them, the permanent, irremediable, archaeologically irreversible inability to determine what this man actually believed, actually wanted, and actually felt, is precisely what makes Ai one of the most fascinating, the most historically instructive, and the most philosophically provocative and most elusive figures in the history of ancient Egypt. The man changed with the times, the man survived, and the man emerged at the end of the most turbulent period in the history of the pharaonic state, as the last man standing, the elderly courtier who placed himself on the throne of Egypt when every other claimant was gone. The death of Tutankhamun, sometime around 1323 BC, at approximately the age of 19, created a succession crisis that was unprecedented in the history of the 18th dynasty. The boy king had no surviving children. His 2 daughters had been stillborn. His wife, Ankhesenamun, herself a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, a princess of the royal blood whose lineage connected her to the most powerful dynasty in the ancient world, was alone, childless, and surrounded by men whose ambitions she could not control and whose intentions she could not trust. What happened next is, without exaggeration, one of the most dramatic, most diplomatically consequential, and most historically revealing, and most consequential episodes in the diplomatic history of the ancient world. An episode that is recorded not in the Egyptian sources, which are silent on the matter, but in the archives of Egypt's greatest rival, the Hittite Empire. Cuneiform tablets discovered in the Hittite capital of Hattusa, modern Bogazkoy in Turkey, contain a text known as the Deeds of Suppiluliuma, compiled by the Hittite king's son Mursili II, that records an extraordinary series of letters between an Egyptian queen and the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I. The queen, identified in the Hittite texts by the title Dakamunzu, which appears to be a rendering of the Egyptian phrase Tehemet Nehezu, meaning the king's wife, wrote to Suppiluliuma with a request that was without precedent in the history of Egyptian diplomacy. My husband died. A son I have not, but to thee, they say, the sons are many. If thou wouldst give me one son of thine, he would become my husband. Never shall I pick out a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am afraid. The letter is extraordinary, not merely for its content but for what it reveals about the desperation of the woman who wrote it. An Egyptian queen, a member of the most powerful royal house in the ancient world, a woman raised in the tradition that regarded foreigners as inferior beings, barely human, unworthy of comparison with the people of the Nile, was begging a foreign king to send her a husband. The word servant, used dismissively, contemptuously, almost certainly refers to a specific individual, a man at the Egyptian court who was positioning himself to marry the queen and seize the throne. Most scholars believe that the servant, the man whom the queen refused to marry, the man from whom she was begging the Hittite king to save her, was Ai. The word servant is not used literally. It is used with the aristocratic contempt of a royal princess, describing a man who, however powerful, however well-connected, however laden with titles and honours, was not of the blood royal, and was therefore, in the queen's estimation, unworthy of the throne, and unworthy of her hand. The desperation of the letter is palpable across 33 centuries. The voice of a young woman who has lost her husband, who has no children, who is surrounded by men who want to use her as a stepping stone to the throne, and who is willing to take the extraordinary and historically unprecedented step of asking a foreign king to send a prince to marry her and become Pharaoh. The request was humiliating. The queen acknowledges as much. The request was dangerous. It risked revealing the weakness of the Egyptian state to its most powerful rival. The request was an act of political desperation, the last resort of a woman who had exhausted every other option and who preferred a foreign husband to the domestic servant, the elderly, powerful, and politically ambitious courtier who was positioning himself to take her and the throne. The identity of the Dakamunzu has been debated by scholars for more than a century. Some have proposed Nefertiti, others Meritaten, but the majority view is that the letter was written by Ankhesenamun, the widow of Tutankhamun, and that the dead husband referred to in the letter is Tutankhamun himself. If this identification is correct, then the letter is evidence of a young woman's desperate attempt to prevent the man she called a servant, the elderly courtier who had served her grandfather, her father, and her husband, from forcing her into a marriage that would give him the legitimacy he needed to take the throne. The letters between Ankhesenamun, if indeed she was the Dakamunzu, and Suppiluliuma are among the most extraordinary diplomatic documents to survive from the ancient world. They are preserved not in the Egyptian archives, where they would presumably have been destroyed or suppressed, but in the Hittite archives at Hattusa, modern Bogazkoy, in central Turkey, where they were discovered back during the excavations of the early 20th century, and where they had been preserved as part of the official record of the Hittite court. The preservation of the letters in the Hittite archives is itself a historical accident of enormous significance. Without the Hittite record, we would have no knowledge of the Dakamunzu affair, no evidence of the desperation that gripped the Egyptian court in the aftermath of Tutankhamun's death, and no hint of the political machinations that led to Ai's seizure of the throne. The Egyptian sources are silent on the entire episode, silent either because the records were destroyed or because the episode was too embarrassing, too politically sensitive, and too revealing of the internal divisions within the Egyptian court to be committed to the official record. The timing of the correspondence is crucial, and it is also uncertain. The letters were written in the interval between Tutankhamun's death and Ai's accession to the throne, an interval that included the 70-day embalming process that Egyptian tradition prescribed for the mummification of the dead pharaoh. The 70 days provided a window, a period during which the throne was technically vacant, during which the various factions within the court were maneuvering for position, and during which a desperate queen could attempt to reach out to a foreign power for help. The delay caused by Suppiluliuma's suspicion consumed weeks or months of this window. Weeks or months during which the political situation in Egypt was hardening, during which Ai's position was strengthening, and during which the possibility of a Hittite marriage was becoming progressively less feasible as the old courtier consolidated his control over the court and the succession. The correspondence reveals a diplomatic exchange that lasted several months, during which the fate of the Egyptian throne hung in the balance, and during which the political situation in Egypt was presumably deteriorating as the various factions within the court maneuvered for position. The delay was fatal, not for the queen, but for the Hittite prince. The months that Suppiluliuma spent verifying the queen's sincerity gave the opponents of the marriage enough time to organize, to plan, and to execute the murder that would prevent a foreign prince, a Hittite, an outsider, a foreigner, a representative of the rival empire that had been contesting Egyptian supremacy in the Levant for decades, from ascending the throne of Egypt. Suppiluliuma was suspicious. The request was unprecedented. No Egyptian queen had ever written to a foreign king asking for a husband. The Hittite king sent an envoy to Egypt to investigate, to determine whether the offer was genuine or a trap. The envoy returned and confirmed that the queen was telling the truth. She was indeed widowed, she was indeed childless, and she was indeed desperate. The queen, frustrated by the delay, wrote again, her second letter even more urgent than the first. If I had a son, should I write to a foreign country in a manner humiliating to me and to my country? You did not believe me and have even spoken thus to me. He who was my husband is dead. I have no son. Shall I then perhaps take one of my servants and make him my husband? I have written to no other country. I have written only to you. Suppiluliuma, persuaded at last, sent his son, a prince named Zananza. The prince never arrived. He was murdered on the way to Egypt, killed, according to the Hittite records, by the people of Egypt. The Hittite king was devastated. "O gods," he cried, according to the account recorded by his son Mursili, "I did no evil, yet the people of Egypt did this to me, and they also attacked the frontier of my country." The grief of the Hittite king is one of the most emotionally powerful passages in the diplomatic literature of the ancient Near East. The grief of a father who had sent his son to Egypt in the hope of placing him on the most prestigious throne in the ancient world, only to learn that his son had been murdered by the very people who had invited him. The identity of the murderers, the people of Egypt who killed the Hittite prince, has never been established. Some scholars have pointed to AI, arguing that the man who had the most to gain from Zenanza's death was the man who wanted to marry the queen himself. Others have pointed to Horemheb, the military commander who had both the means and the motive to prevent a foreign prince from ascending the throne. Still others have suggested the murder was carried out by a faction within the Egyptian court, perhaps the military establishment, perhaps a coalition of interests that saw a Hittite prince as an existential threat to the Egyptian state. The truth is that we do not know who killed Zenanza, and the identification of the murderer would fundamentally change our understanding of Ai's character. The murder of Zenanza triggered a war between Egypt and the Hittite Empire, a war whose consequences included a plague that the Hittite soldiers brought back from their raids on Egyptian territory, a plague that would eventually kill both Suppiluliuma himself and his immediate successor, Arnawanda II. The murder also sealed the fate of Ankhesenamun, the young queen whose desperate letters had failed to save her from the man she feared. After Zenanza's death, Ankhesenamun's options were exhausted. The foreign husband she had requested was dead. The servant she had feared was in position. The political momentum was with Ai, the elderly courtier who had the titles, the connections, the bureaucratic network, and the theological credentials, the bureaucratic network, the administrative expertise, and the accumulated political capital of 50 years of service to claim the throne. The marriage that Ankhesenamun had tried so desperately to prevent became, in the aftermath of Zenanza's murder, inevitable. A blue glass ring discovered in the early 20th century, and now in the collection of the Egyptisches Museum in Berlin, bears the cartouches of both Ai and Ankhesenamun together, evidence that the marriage the young queen had tried so desperately, so humiliatingly, so dangerously, so unprecedentedly to prevent had indeed taken place. The ring is a small, easily overlooked object, barely significant in the vast and overwhelming catalogue of thousands of Egyptian artifacts that fill the museums of the world. But its historical implications are enormous, because it provides the only surviving material evidence that Ai and Ankhesenamun were married, and that Ai's claim to the throne was legitimized, at least in part, through his marriage to the widow of the previous pharaoh. The marriage itself raises questions that the evidence cannot answer. Was it a willing union or a forced one? Did Ankhesenamun accept the marriage as a political necessity, an inevitable consequence of her failure to secure a Hittite husband, or did she resist to the end? The Dakamunzu letters suggest that she was desperate to avoid the marriage, that she found the prospect of marrying a servant so humiliating that she preferred to appeal to a foreign enemy for help. The ring suggests that the marriage happened regardless of her feelings. The gap between the letters and the ring, between the desperate resistance and the apparent compliance, is itself evidence of the power dynamics that governed the Egyptian court in the aftermath of Tutankhamun's death. The queen had the lineage, Ai had the power, and power in the end prevailed. A had married the young widow of the pharaoh he had served, the granddaughter of the man he may have been related to by blood, and had claimed the throne of Egypt. And it gets worse, because Ai did not merely seize the throne, he legitimized his seizure through the most sacred ritual in the Egyptian funerary tradition. On the north wall of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, painted in haste, with drips and corrections that suggest the work was done under extreme time pressure, there is a scene that shows Jikihara performing the opening of the mouth ceremony on the mummified body of Tutankhamun. The ceremony was traditionally performed by the deceased pharaoh's son and heir, It was the ritual through which the heir established his legitimacy, declared himself the rightful successor, and assumed the authority that the dead pharaoh had bequeathed. I had no blood claim to the throne. He was not Tutankhamun's son. He was not, by any conventional interpretation of the Egyptian succession, the rightful heir, but by performing the opening of the mouth ceremony, by painting himself on the walls of the dead king's tomb in the role of the son and heir, I was creating a theological fact, a visual and ritual argument for his legitimacy that would be visible to the gods, and that would stand carved in stone and painted in pigment for eternity. The scene is one of the most politically significant images in the history of Egyptian art, and one of the most chilling. It shows an elderly man in the leopard skin robe of the Sem priest, wearing the blue Kepresh crown of the pharaoh, performing the most sacred ritual in the Egyptian funerary tradition on the body of a boy who had died at 19. The artistic quality of the scene itself has been the subject of extensive scholarly discussion. The paintings in Tutankhamun's burial chamber are notable for their haste. The surfaces were not properly prepared, the pigments were applied before the plaster was fully dry, and the brown spots that are visible on the walls may be the result of microbial growth in the damp conditions that the premature sealing of the tomb created. The haste is itself evidence that the burial was conducted under time pressure, that the small group of men who organized and supervised the burial, his closest political allies, and the priests and craftsmen who worked under their direction, were racing against a political clock whose ticking was audible to everyone at the Egyptian court, that was ticking toward the moment when their rivals could challenge their authority, and that the theological and political imperatives of establishing the succession outweighed the aesthetic considerations of producing a properly finished tomb. The scene of performing the opening of the mouth ceremony was painted quickly by artists who were working under pressure to complete a task that would determine the political future of the Egyptian state. And the drips and the corrections and the unfinished details that the scene contains are, paradoxically, among the most historically revealing features of the tomb, because they tell us not merely what was painted, but how urgently it was painted, and why. The scene has been interpreted by scholars as many things: an act of genuine piety, a political advertisement masquerading as a pious act, a naked and brazenly calculated seizure of power disguised as the performance of a sacred religious obligation. The Egyptologist Kent Weeks has suggested that the haste with which the tomb was sealed, the brown spots on the paint that may indicate the burial was completed before the plaster was fully dry, reflects the urgency of Ai's political situation. The old man needed to bury the boy king, perform the ritual, and establish his claim to the throne before his rival, the military commander Horemheb, could return from his military campaigns in the Levant and challenge the succession that Ai was in the process of engineering. The scene on the north wall of Tutankhamun's burial chamber is, when one understands its political context, one of the most extraordinary and most calculated images in the entire history of Egyptian art. It is not merely a religious scene. It is a political document, a visual argument for the legitimacy of a man who had no blood claim to the throne. The scene shows Ai in the full regalia of the pharaoh, wearing the blue Hepresh crown that symbolized royal military authority, the ceremonial leopard skin robe that identified him as the Sem priest, and the ritual implements of the Sem priest, performing the ceremony on Tutankhamun, who is depicted as Osiris. The theology is clear. Just as Horus performed the opening of the mouth on his father Osiris, thereby establishing his right to rule as the legitimate heir, so Ai performs the ceremony on Tutankhamun, thereby claiming the theological role of the heir and the political authority of the successor. The scene is unprecedented. No other example exists in the entire history of Egyptian art of a successor performing the opening of the mouth ceremony on a deceased pharaoh in a royal tomb. The ritual was traditionally performed by the pharaoh's son, and the fact that Ai, who was not Tutankhamun's son, is depicted performing it is evidence of the extraordinary and historically unprecedented lengths to which the old courtier was willing to go, the theological risks he was willing to take, the ancient and venerable ritual conventions he was willing to bend or violate. the sacred traditions he was willing to bend to his political purposes in order to establish his contested and constitutionally dubious claim to the throne of Egypt. The question that hangs over this entire episode, the question that scholars have debated for more than a century, and that the evidence does not allow us to answer, is whether A merely took advantage of Tutankhamun's death or whether he caused it. The Egyptologist Bob Brier, in his book The Murder of Tutankhamun, argued that I killed the boy king, that the fracture in Tutankhamun's leg, visible in the CT scans and the X-rays, was evidence of an assault rather than an accident. The theory is dramatic, but the medical evidence does not conclusively support it. The 2005 CT scan found no evidence of foul play, and the fracture in the leg has been interpreted by many medical experts as the result of a fall rather than an attack. The question remains stubbornly and perhaps permanently open, and it may remain open forever, because the question of whether I murdered Tutankhamun is, in many ways, the wrong question. Not because it is unimportant, but because it is unanswerable, and because the obsession with the murder hypothesis has distracted attention from the more important and more answerable questions about I's political career and his role in the succession crisis. The question that the evidence can address is not whether I killed Tutankhamun, but how I positioned himself to take advantage of Tutankhamun's death, how the old courtier maneuvered himself into the theological and political position that allowed him to seize the throne in the brief window between the boy king's death and Horemheb's potential challenge. The answer to that question, visible in the scene on the north wall of the burial chamber, visible in the ring bearing the cartouches of I and Ankhesenamun, visible in the haste with which the tomb was prepared and sealed, is that I was, at minimum, a political opportunist of extraordinary skill and speed, a man who understood the subtle and complex dynamics of the Egyptian royal succession with a clarity, a precision, and a depth of practical knowledge, and a precision that could only have come from decades of observation and preparation. The evidence that would settle the murder question definitively. Eyewitness testimony, documentary records, forensic evidence of the kind that modern criminal investigations rely upon simply does not exist. The question of Tutankhamun's death remains one of the most debated topics in Egyptology, a question that has generated books, television documentaries, academic conferences, and an enormous volume of speculation that ranges from the carefully reasoned to the frankly sensational. The prominent American Egyptologist Bob Brier's sensational and widely discussed murder hypothesis, first presented in his 1998 book, was based on X-ray evidence that showed what appeared to be a bone fragment at the base of Tutankhamun's skull, which Brier interpreted as evidence of a blow to the head. Subsequent CT scanning, conducted in 2005 under the direction of Zahi Hawass, found that the bone fragment was the result of the mummification process rather than an injury, and the murder theory based on the skull evidence has been largely abandoned by the scholarly community. However, the broader question of whether I was involved in Tutankhamun's death, through poisoning, through neglect, through the manipulation of the boy king's medical care, or through some other means that would leave no trace in the skeletal record, remains open because the methods of murder available in the ancient world included many that would be invisible to modern forensic analysis. The succession crisis that followed Tutankhamun's death was, in many ways, the inevitable consequence of the demographic catastrophe that had afflicted the late 18th dynasty royal family. The line of Amenhotep III, which had been, at its peak, one of the most prolific and most secure royal families in the history of the dynasty, had been decimated by the events of the Amarna period. The crown prince Thutmose had died before his father. Akhenaten's daughters, 6 girls, no surviving sons, had died or disappeared one by one during the latter years of the reign. Nefertiti had vanished from the record. Smenkhar had appeared briefly and then disappeared. Tutankhamun himself had died childless, his 2 daughters stillborn, his genetic legacy compromised by the inbreeding that had characterized his parents' union. By the time of Tutankhamun's death, the male line of the 18th dynasty was effectively extinct. There were no princes, no male relatives of the blood royal, no one who could claim the throne by right of birth and lineage. The vacuum was filled by the men who had served the dynasty, the courtiers, the administrators, the military commanders who had managed the Egyptian state during the reigns of the last Amarna pharaohs, and who now found themselves in a position to claim the ultimate prize. I and Horemheb were the two most powerful of these men, the civilian administrator and the military commander, the old courtier and the professional soldier, the man who controlled the civilian bureaucracy, the diplomatic networks, and the religious institutions, and the man who controlled the army, the chariot corps, the frontier garrisons, and the entire military establishment that constituted both the external defensive capability and the internal coercive power of the Egyptian state. The competition between them, a competition that was conducted through political maneuvering, theological ritual, and strategic marriage rather than through military confrontation, defined the final chapter of the 18th dynasty and determined the course of Egyptian history for generations. What we can say, what the evidence does support, is that A was in the right place at the right time, with the right titles and the right connections, to seize the throne when the opportunity presented itself. Whether he created the opportunity or merely exploited it is a question that the silence of 3,000 years has made unanswerable. The reign of I as Pharaoh lasted approximately 4 years, from roughly 1323 to 1319 BC, and it is one of the most poorly documented reigns in the history of the 18th dynasty. The brevity of the reign, the systematic erasure of I's monuments by his successor Horemheb, and the general confusion of the later Amarna period have combined to produce a historical record that is fragmentary, ambiguous, and in many cases almost entirely blank. The pharaoh, who had been one of the most powerful and most well-documented courtiers in the Egyptian state, whose tomb at Amarna is one of the largest and most elaborately decorated of the noble tombs whose titles and honours fill columns of hieroglyphic text, became, upon ascending the throne, one of the most obscure pharaohs in the entire history of the dynasty. What we know about I's reign can be summarized in a few paragraphs, and the brevity of the summary is itself significant, because it reflects not merely the shortness of the reign, but the thoroughness with which Horemheb erased the evidence of it. I continued the restoration of the traditional religion that had been initiated under Tutankhamun, reopening temples, refunding priesthoods, recommissioning cult statues, and generally working to repair the institutional damage that Akhenaten's revolution had caused. He built a mortuary temple at Medinet Habu on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, in the area traditionally reserved for the funerary monuments of the pharaohs. But the temple was later usurped by Horemheb, who erased I's name and replaced it with his own. He built or restored a rock-cut chapel at Akhmim, his hometown, the city of the fertility god Min, the city where his family had its roots, and where the priesthood of Min had sustained the family's influence for generations. The chapel at Akhmim is significant not merely as a religious monument, but as a political statement, a declaration that the pharaoh who sat on the throne of Egypt had not forgotten his provincial origins, and that the connection between the crown and the city of Akhmim remained strong. The choice of Min as the dedicatee of the chapel is itself revealing. Min was an ancient and deeply traditional deity, one of the oldest gods in the Egyptian pantheon, a god whose worship had survived the Aten revolution intact, precisely because the revolution had been focused on the major state cults and had largely ignored the provincial traditions. By dedicating a chapel to Min, I was aligning himself with the forces of tradition and continuity, a calculated act of theological positioning by a man who understood that his legitimacy as pharaoh depended on his ability to present himself as a defender of the traditional order that the revolution had disrupted. The question of what happened to Ankhesemen after her marriage to I is one of the most poignant and most unanswerable questions of the late 18th dynasty. The young queen, who had been born in the heretic city of Amarna, who had been married to Tutankhamun at a young age, who had borne 2 stillborn daughters, who had written desperate letters to a foreign king, begging for a husband who would save her from the servant she feared, disappears from the historical record after the marriage to I. The blue glass ring bearing the cartouches of Tutankhamun is the last trace of the queen in the archaeological record. After the ring, silence. She was never, as far as the evidence indicates, Ai's great royal wife. That title was held by Tay, the woman who had been Nefertiti's nurse and who had accompanied Ai through the revolution and the restoration. Ankhesenamun may have died shortly after the marriage. She may have been marginalized, her royal status reduced, her political significance eliminated once Ai had obtained the legitimacy that the marriage conferred. Or she may have lived on, in obscurity, in the shadow of the old pharaoh and his wife Tay, a princess of the blood royal, a daughter of the revolution, a widow of the restoration, a young woman whose extraordinary and tragic life had been shaped entirely by forces she could not control, by men she could not resist, and by political dynamics she could not escape, and whose fate was determined, at every turn and at every critical juncture, by men whose ambition she could not escape, and whose political calculations treated her not as a person, but as a legitimizing instrument. The reign of Ai, those 4 brief years between approximately 1323 and 1319 BC, represents the last gasp of the Amarna generation, the final chapter of a family saga that had begun with Yuya's rise to prominence at the court of Amenhotep III, and that would end with the military takeover of Horemheb and the establishment of the 19th dynasty under Ramesses I. Ai was the last connection to the old order, the last man who had known the Golden Age, who had served the revolution, who had managed the restoration, and who understood, from personal experience, the full arc of the most extraordinary and most catastrophic period in the history of the pharaonic state. If the identification of Ai as Yuya's son is correct, and the circumstantial evidence strongly supports it, then Ai was approximately 20 years old when his sister Ti married Amenhotep III, approximately 40 when Akhenaten began his revolution, approximately 55 when Akhenaten died and Tutankhamun was placed on the throne, and approximately 65 when Tutankhamun died and Ai seized the throne for himself. The chronology is approximate, the dates are debated, the ages are estimated, but the broad outline is clear. Ai's career spanned the better part of half a century, encompassing the Golden Age, the Revolution, the Counter-Revolution, and the Succession Crisis, and his ascent to the throne came not at the beginning or the middle of his career, but at its very end, when the man was old, when the dynasty was exhausted, and when the political field had been cleared, through death and disgrace and demographic catastrophe, of every competitor except the military commander Horemheb. The length of Ai's career, and the range of historical events he witnessed and participated in, is unprecedented among the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. No other individual whose career is documented in the sources of the period spans the same range of time and the same variety of political and theological environments. Ai served under the most magnificent pharaoh of the Golden Age, the most radical pharaoh of the Revolution, and the most tragic pharaoh of the Restoration, and he adapted his behavior, his theology, and his political positioning to each new environment with a consistency and a precision that speaks of either extraordinary conviction or extraordinary cynicism, and the surviving evidence, frustratingly and perhaps permanently, does not allow us to determine which interpretation is correct. When Ai died, the last surviving thread of living personal memory connecting the present to the revolutionary Amarna period died with him. The personal knowledge, the first-hand experience, the accumulated personal understanding of what had happened, why it had happened, and what it had cost, in human suffering, institutional damage, theological confusion, and political instability, the people and the institutions that had lived through it. What remained was the monuments and the inscriptions, and these Horemheb would systematically, comprehensively, and with the cold efficiency of a professional military operation, destroy. His hometown, the city of the god Min, which suggests that even as pharaoh, Ai maintained a connection to the provincial roots and the local deity that had shaped his family's identity for generations. Ai also appears to have attempted to secure the succession for his own designated heir, a man named Nachtmin, who held the titles general and fan-bearer on the right hand of the king, and who may have been Ai's son or grandson. Nachtmin is known primarily from 5 Shabti figures that he donated to Tutankhamun's funerary equipment, figures inscribed with his titles and his name, placed in the tomb of the dead king by a man who was, at that moment, one of the most powerful military figures in the Egyptian state. The relationship between Nakhmin and Ai is not explicitly stated in the surviving sources, but the combination of shared geographic origin, shared titles, and Ai's apparent efforts to promote Nakhmin's career has led most scholars to conclude that Nakhmin was Ai's chosen successor, and that the old pharaoh was attempting to establish a dynasty of his own, rooted in the Akhmin family that had provided queens and courtiers to the Egyptian state for 3 generations. The attempt to establish Nakhmin as the designated successor is one of the most consequential political maneuvers of the late 18th dynasty. By promoting Nakhmin, by granting him the titles Crown Prince and King's Son, Ai was making a public declaration of his intention to bypass Horemheb and to establish his own dynastic line. The gamble was enormous. It put Ai in direct political conflict with the most powerful military figure in the Egyptian state. The attempt failed. Nakhmin disappears from the historical record after Ai's death, his fate unknown, his monuments defaced, his stelae at Akhmim destroyed, his career erased with the same thoroughness that Horemheb applied to the erasure of Ai himself. The question of Ai's relationship with Horemheb during the 4 years of his reign is one of the most important questions in the study of the late 18th dynasty, and one that the evidence does not adequately address. Did Horemheb serve Ai loyally, as he had served Tutankhamun? Did the military commander accept Ai's accession and continue to conduct the foreign and military policies that the Egyptian state required? Or did the relationship between the 2 men deteriorate? Did Horemheb resent the old courtier's seizure of the throne that Horemheb himself may have coveted, and did the resentment grow during the 4 years of Ai's reign until it exploded after Ai's death in the comprehensive destruction of the old pharaoh's memory? The evidence suggests tension rather than open conflict. The public and deliberate promotion of the general Nakhmin as his formally designated successor and heir was a direct, unmistakable, and politically provocative affront to Horemheb, a public declaration that the old pharaoh intended to bypass the general and to establish his own dynastic line. The promotion must have been understood by Horemheb as a challenge, and the general's response, when it came, was devastating in its completeness. But during Ai's lifetime, there is no evidence of open confrontation, no record of military rebellion, no evidence of political crisis, no sign that the 2 men's rivalry escalated beyond the level of political maneuvering and mutual distrust. The conflict was cold, and it remained cold until Ai's death gave Horemheb the opportunity to act. The military commander had been waiting through Tutankhamun's reign, waiting through Ai's reign, accumulating power, building alliances, conducting the military campaigns that restored Egyptian authority in the Levant and Nubia. And when Ai died, an old man, probably in his 70s, having ruled for just 4 years, Horemheb struck. The military commander who had waited patiently through Tutankhamun's reign and who had been denied the succession by Ai's political maneuvering now moved with the speed and the decisiveness of a professional soldier seizing a military objective. He seized the throne, claiming the pharaonic titles, assuming the royal prerogatives, and presenting himself to the Egyptian people as the legitimate successor, and as the man who would complete the restoration that Tutankhamun had begun, and that Ai had, in Horemheb's view, merely continued as a caretaker. The speed of Horemheb's accession suggests that the military commander had been preparing for this moment for years, building alliances within the army, cultivating relationships with the priesthood of Amun, positioning himself as the indispensable man whose military competence and administrative ability made him the obvious choice for the throne. The tomb that Horemheb had built for himself at Saqqara, a magnificent private tomb decorated with scenes of military triumph and royal favour, was itself a political advertisement, a public declaration of the general's qualifications for the highest office that the Egyptian state could confer. He removed Nakhmin, and he began the systematic destruction of Ai's memory that would make the old courtier one of the most thoroughly, the most comprehensively, and the most systematically erased pharaohs in the entire 3,000-year history of the Egyptian state. The destruction was comprehensive. Horemheb's agents entered I's tomb in the Western Valley of the Kings. The tomb designated WV23, the tomb that had been intended, according to the theory proposed by the Egyptologist Reginald Engelbach and subsequently supported by several other scholars, for Tutankhamun himself, a tomb that was larger and more architecturally appropriate for a royal burial than the small tomb KV62, in which Tutankhamun was actually interred before the boy king's sudden, unexpected, and politically destabilizing death at the age of approximately 19 forced the hasty and improvised use of the significantly smaller and less architecturally distinguished tomb KV62. The agents smashed the red granite sarcophagus. They chiseled I's name from every surface where it appeared. They hacked the image of I's wife Tay from the walls. They destroyed any trace of the pharaoh's identity, any name, any image, any inscription that would allow the gods to recognize the dead man, and that would allow his car to find its way back to the body. The destruction was not random, not accidental, and not the work of opportunistic tomb robbers seeking portable wealth. It was targeted, precise, and theologically motivated. The agents did not destroy the tomb itself. They destroyed the person within it. They left the architecture intact and erased the individual. The destruction extended beyond the tomb. Horemheb usurped I's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, erasing I's name and substituting his own, claiming the building and its endowments as if he had built it himself. He usurped a colossal statue, a massive figure roughly 5 meters tall that I had carved and inscribed with his own royal titulary, which had itself been carved over the original titulary of Tutankhamun. Horemheb erased I's inscriptions and replaced them with his own. The third set of names to be carved on the same statue, a palimpsest of royal claims that traces the succession from Tutankhamun to I to Horemheb in the language of chiseled stone. The erasure of I was part of a larger campaign, a comprehensive damnatio memoriae that targeted not merely I, but the entire Amarna period and everyone associated with it. Horemheb erased Akhenaten. He erased Smenkhare. He erased Tutankhamun. He erased I. He removed their names from the king lists, the official historical records of the Egyptian state that listed every pharaoh in sequence from the beginning of time. In the king list at Abydos, compiled under Seti I, Horemheb's second successor, the sequence jumps directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if the entire Amarna period, the revolution, the restoration, the boy king, the old courtier, had never happened. Horemheb did not merely erase I, he erased the entire chapter of history in which I had lived and served and seized the throne. The discovery and investigation of I's tomb spans nearly 2 centuries of archaeological work, a history that reflects the evolving methods and the changing priorities of Egyptological research from the era of romantic, individually driven treasure hunting and European imperial adventurism to the era of systematic, theoretically informed, and methodologically rigorous scientific excavation. The discovery of I's tomb by Belzoni in 1816 was one of the explorer's many achievements in the Valley of the Kings and the Western Valley. Achievements that also included the opening of the Tomb of Seti I, KV17, one of the most magnificently decorated royal tombs in the entire necropolis. Belzoni was a remarkable figure, a former circus strongman from Padua who had reinvented himself as an explorer and antiquarian, who combined physical courage with genuine intellectual curiosity, and who conducted his explorations with an enthusiasm and an energy that compensated, at least partially, for the lack of systematic methodology that would characterize later archaeological work. When Belzoni entered WV23, he found a tomb that had been comprehensively looted and desecrated, the sarcophagus smashed, the wall decorations defaced, the burial equipment removed or destroyed. The looting was old, probably dating to the period immediately after Horemheb's accession, when the new pharaoh's agents entered the tomb to carry out the damnatio memoriae that would remove I from the historical record and from the afterlife. But the sarcophagus, even in its shattered state, was recognizable as a royal burial. The unmistakable red granite material, The impressive scale and craftsmanship of the object, and the surviving traces of carved and painted decoration, all clearly indicated that this had been the final resting place of a pharaoh, even if the pharaoh's name had been systematically removed from every surface. Belzoni's initial discovery in 1816 was characteristic of the early period of Egyptian archaeology. The Italian explorer was primarily interested in finding portable antiquities that could be shipped to European museums, and his documentation of the tomb was cursory at best. Subsequent visitors to the tomb in the 19th century included the German Egyptologist Carl Richard Lepsius, who documented some of the surviving wall decorations, and the British archaeologist Arthur Weigel, who noted the extensive damage to the tomb's decorative program and the systematic erasure of I's name and image. The tomb of I, WV23, was first fully excavated and cleared by the University of Minnesota Egyptian Expedition in 1972, under the direction of Otto Schaden. The 1972 excavation was one of the most significant, the most systematically conducted, and the most archaeologically productive investigations ever undertaken in the Western Valley, a region that had received far less archaeological attention than the main Valley of the Kings, and that still contained, as Schaden's work would demonstrate, significant unexcavated or incompletely documented material. Schaden and his team cleared the tomb systematically, recording every artifact, every wall decoration, and every structural feature with the methodological rigor that modern archaeological practice demands. The work took several seasons, and the results, published in a series of academic papers and reports, transformed our understanding of I's burial and of the political circumstances that surrounded his death and interment. The excavation revealed a tomb that had been comprehensively looted and systematically desecrated, but that still retained enough archaeological evidence to reconstruct, at least in outline, the burial that had taken place there more than 3,000 years earlier. The tomb follows an architectural plan that closely parallels the royal tomb of Akhenaten at Amarna, a straight axis with descending corridors and a well chamber that opens directly into the burial chamber. The architectural similarity has been interpreted by scholars as evidence that the tomb was designed during the Amarna period, when I was still a courtier of the heretic Pharaoh, and that it was adapted for royal use when I ascended the throne, a hypothesis that, if correct, adds another layer of irony to the story of a man who spent his career at the boundary between the royal and the non-royal worlds. The absence of standard royal funerary equipment, no canopic shrine, no shabti figures, no gilded nested shrines, is one of the most puzzling aspects of the tomb and one that has generated significant scholarly debate. Schaden's suggestion that these items may never have been placed in the tomb is plausible but not certain. It is equally possible that the items were present at the time of the burial and were removed during Horemheb's desecration or during subsequent robberies. The difficulty of distinguishing between an absence that reflects the original burial and an absence that reflects subsequent looting is one of the fundamental challenges of Egyptian funerary archaeology, a challenge that is particularly acute in the case of a tomb that was both systematically desecrated and repeatedly robbed. The fate of I's mummy is itself a mystery. The body of the pharaoh has never been conclusively identified, unlike the mummies of many other 18th dynasty pharaohs, which were recovered from the royal caches at Deir el-Bahari and the tomb of Amenhotep II. The mummy of I has not been found in any identified context. Fragmentary skeletal remains discovered in the tomb during Schaden's excavation may represent the remains of I, but the identification is uncertain, and the bones are too fragmentary to allow the kind of comprehensive physical examination that has been conducted on the mummies of Tutankhamun, Amenhotep III, and other 18th dynasty pharaohs. Some scholars have suggested that I's mummy may have been cached in the tomb of Horemheb, KV57, during the later reorganization of the royal burials, but this theory remains unconfirmed. The possibility that I's mummy was deliberately destroyed by Horemheb's agents, destroyed as part of the damnatio memoriae, destroyed in order to deny the old pharaoh the physical, intact, properly mummified body that the elaborate Egyptian funerary tradition absolutely and unconditionally required for the individual's continued existence in the afterlife, cannot be excluded and would, if true, represent the most extreme expression of the political hatred that Horemheb bore toward his predecessor. The burial chamber contained the remains of the red granite sarcophagus, shattered in antiquity, its fragments scattered across the floor. The red granite sarcophagus, reconstructed from its shattered fragments by modern conservators, was originally decorated with images of the four great protective goddesses of the Egyptian funerary tradition: Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Selket, their arms outstretched in protective gestures, the same iconographic program that would later be used in the canopic shrine of Tutankhamun. The burial chamber also contained what Shadden described as the most significant artistic discovery of the excavation: a unique scene of hunting and fishing in the marshes, painted on the walls of the burial chamber. The discovery of the hunting and fishing scene was one of the most significant finds of the 1972 excavation, and it has generated a substantial scholarly literature about the relationship between Ai's non-royal background and his choice of tomb decoration. In the private tombs of the Egyptian nobility, the tombs of the wealthy officials, the administrators, the provincial governors who constituted the upper echelons of Egyptian society, hunting and fishing scenes were among the most common and most beloved decorative motifs. The scenes depicted the tomb owner engaged in the pleasures of the natural world, spearing fish in the marshes, hunting birds with throw sticks, pursuing hippopotamuses and crocodiles in the papyrus thickets of the Nile. The scenes were not merely decorative, they were theological, representing the triumph of order over chaos, the mastery of the civilized world over the dangerous and unpredictable forces of nature. The scene is remarkable because it is the only known example of such a scene in a royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Hunting and fishing scenes are common in the tombs of the nobility, but had never been used in a pharaoh's burial chamber. The presence of the scene has been interpreted by scholars as evidence of Ai's non-royal origins, a visual echo of the private tomb tradition, the tradition of the nobility, the tradition of the courtier class to which Ai had belonged for the vast majority of his long career, in which Ai had been raised and educated, carried into the royal tomb by a man who had spent most of his life as a courtier rather than a king. The absence of certain standard elements of the royal burial is equally significant. Shadden noted, with particular emphasis, that no canopic chest or shrine was found. The container that would have held the jars, containing the pharaoh's preserved internal organs. No Shabti figures, the magical servants that were supposed to perform agricultural labour on behalf of the dead king in the afterlife, were discovered. No gilded wooden shrines, the nested boxes that would normally encase the sarcophagus, were found. Shadden suggested that these items may never have been placed in the tomb at all, that the burial of Ai was, even before Horemheb's desecration, a notably sparse affair, perhaps reflecting the brevity of the reign, the haste of the burial, or the specific and deeply contested political circumstances that surrounded the elderly pharaoh's death, burial, and immediate posthumous interment. And now we arrive at the question that the smashed sarcophagus and the chiselled walls and the erased cartouches and the desperate letters from a frightened queen all converge upon. The question that makes the story of Ai not merely a footnote in the history of the 18th dynasty, but a profound meditation on the nature of power, ambition, and the terrible silence that falls when the powerful are erased. Who was Ai, really? The answer is that we do not know. We know his titles, we know his approximate dates, we know his connections, his probable father Yuya, his probable sister Tai, his probable daughter Nefertiti, his wife Te. We know his career, the courtier Amana, the advisor under Tutankhamun, the pharaoh for 4 brief years. We know his tomb and its destruction. We know his monuments and their erasure. But we do not know the man. We do not know what he believed. Whether the great hymn to the Aten that he inscribed on his tomb walls represented a genuine theological conviction or a calculated act of political conformity. We do not know what he wanted, whether the throne was the goal of a lifetime of patient manoeuvring or an unexpected opportunity seized by an old man who found himself, in the confusion following a young king's death, in a position that he had never anticipated. We do not know what he felt about the revolution he served, about the restoration he managed, about the boy king he buried, about the queen he may have forced into marriage, about the Hittite prince who died on the road to Egypt. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the people of the ancient world, and the story of A is the evidence. We assume that the great figures of history are knowable, that if we gather enough evidence, decipher enough inscriptions, excavate enough tombs, we will eventually understand who they were and what they wanted. The story of Ai demonstrates the limits of that assumption. Here is a man who stood at the center of the most dramatic period in the history of ancient Egypt, who was present at the Golden Age, the Revolution, the Counter-Revolution, and the Succession Crisis, and about whom we know almost nothing that is personal, intimate, or revelatory. We know what he did. We do not know why he did it. We know where he stood at every major event in the history of the late 18th dynasty. We do not know what he thought about any of them. We know that he served the Aten, but we do not know whether he believed in the Aten. We know that he restored Amun, but we do not know whether he believed in Amun. We know that he performed the opening of the mouth ceremony on Tutankhamun, but we do not know whether the ceremony was an act of genuine piety, a calculated political maneuver, or a cold-blooded exploitation of a dead boy's body for the purpose of seizing power. We know that he married Ankhesenamun, but we do not know whether the marriage was a political necessity or a forced union imposed on a young woman who had written desperate letters to a foreign king begging to be saved. The gap between the evidence and the person is, in the case of Ai, almost total, and it is a gap that no future archaeological discovery is likely to close. The kinds of evidence that would illuminate Ai's inner life, personal letters, private journals, intimate correspondence of the sort that survives from later historical periods, simply did not exist in ancient Egypt, or if they existed, they were written on papyrus that has long since disintegrated. The monumental inscriptions that survive, the tomb decorations, the temple reliefs, the official texts, are public documents designed to present the individual in the most favorable light possible and to conform to the conventions of the genre rather than to reveal the personality behind the titles. The great hymn to the Aten tells us what Ai's tomb walls proclaimed. It does not tell us what Ai believed. The Gold of Honor scene tells us what the Pharaoh chose to publicly recognize. It does not tell us what Ai felt about the recognition. The opening of the mouth scene tells us what ritual Ai performed. It does not tell us whether the performance was an act of faith or an act of calculated political manipulation. The contrast between Ai and Tutankhamun, the two pharaohs whose reigns bookend the succession crisis, is itself illuminating. Tutankhamun is, paradoxically, one of the most physically known individuals from the ancient world. His body has been X-rayed, CT scanned, DNA tested, and reconstructed with a level of medical detail that is normally reserved for living patients. His clubfoot, his malaria, his bone disease, his broken leg, all are documented with scientific precision. His body is more thoroughly known to modern science than his mind will ever be. A, by contrast, is one of the most bureaucratically known individuals from the ancient world. His titles, his positions, his career trajectory are documented with administrative detail. But his physical body is lost, his mummy unidentified, his physical remains uncertain, his genetic profile unknown. We know Tutankhamun's body and not his mind. We know Ai's career and not his body. The two pharaohs are, in a sense, complementary mysteries, each preserving what the other has lost, each revealing the limitations of the other's evidence. The opacity of the ancient record is not unique to Ai. It is a general condition of the study of the ancient world, a condition that affects our understanding of every individual whose life is known primarily through monumental inscriptions and official texts. But the opacity is particularly acute in the case of Ai, because Ai's career was defined by transformation, by the successive adoption and abandonment of theological positions, by the navigation of contradictory political currents, by the adaptation to circumstances that would have destroyed a less flexible individual. The transformations are documented, but the motivation behind them is not. And without the motivation, the person behind the career remains invisible, a shadow moving through the most dramatic period in the history of ancient Egypt, leaving footprints but no face. and it is a reminder that the ancient world, the world of pyramids and temples and obelisks, the world of hieroglyphic inscriptions that cover entire temple walls, the world of mummies whose physical bodies have been preserved for more than 3,000 years, for all its extraordinary capacity for physical preservation and its exquisitely preserved mummies, was populated by human beings whose inner lives are as inaccessible to us as the thoughts of strangers on a crowded street. The theological ambiguity of I's position at Amarna raises a broader question about the nature of religious conviction in the Egyptian court, a question that scholars have debated extensively that the evidence, characteristically, does not resolve. The Amarna revolution was imposed from above by a pharaoh whose absolute authority left no room for dissent, whose theological certainty tolerated no opposition, and whose willingness to close temples, disband priesthoods, and erase divine names demonstrated the consequences of resistance. In this environment, the inscriptions and the tomb decorations of the courtiers, including I's inscription of the great hymn, may reflect not genuine belief but compelled conformity, the outward expression of a theological position that the individual was required to adopt as a condition of continued employment, continued influence, and continued survival. The Amarna court was not a democracy. It was a theocratic autocracy in which the pharaoh's theological vision was the only acceptable worldview, and in which any deviation from that vision risked the loss of everything that a courtier had spent decades accumulating. I's apparent devotion to the Aten, the tomb inscriptions, the gold of honor, the highest titles in the revolutionary state, may therefore tell us nothing about his actual beliefs and everything about his political intelligence. The same argument, of course, applies to his apparent devotion to Amun after the restoration, the reopening of the temples, the refunding of the priesthoods, the erasure of the Aten, may reflect not genuine belief, but the same political intelligence applied to a different theological environment. The possibility that I's entire career was a masterpiece of theological cynicism, a 50-year performance of successive and contradictory religious convictions, each one perfectly calibrated to the demands of the current regime, is disturbing, but it is also consistent with the evidence, which shows a man who served every theology, the Aten under Akhenaten, Amun under Tutankhamun, the traditional pantheon under his own reign, with equal professional competence, equal apparent devotion, and equal willingness to abandon the previous theology when the political and theological winds changed direction, and who was destroyed not by his beliefs, but by the political miscalculation of trying to pass the throne to Nakhmin rather than to Horemheb. The remarkable and historically unprecedented career of I spans the entire dramatic arc of the late 18th dynasty, from the golden age of Amenhotep III to the revolution of Akhenaten, to the restoration of Tutankhamun, to the succession crisis that ended the dynasty. No other individual, no pharaoh, no queen, no priest, no general, is documented across the same span of time and the same range of historical events. I is the thread that connects the golden age to the collapse, the one continuous presence in a narrative of radical transformation, catastrophic disruption, and comprehensive restoration. And yet the thread is opaque. We can trace its winding path through the complex and turbulent historical record of the late 18th dynasty, but we cannot see through it to the individual human being, the thinking, feeling, doubting, calculating person who held it. Let that sink in. The man who may have been the father of Nefertiti, the most famous queen in the history of ancient Egypt, is unknown to us. The man who inscribed the most beautiful religious poem of the ancient world on his tomb walls, the great hymn to the Aten, may not have believed a word of it. The man who performed the most sacred ritual in the Egyptian funerary tradition, the opening of the mouth ceremony on the mummified body of Tutankhamun, may have killed the boy he was burying. We do not know. The evidence does not tell us. And the deep and impenetrable silence of 33 centuries has made the answers, if they ever existed, permanently, irretrievably, and irrecoverably beyond the reach of historical scholarship. This is not science fiction. This is the reality of the historical record, a record that preserves titles and dates and monuments, but that loses inevitably and permanently the human beings who held the titles, who lived through the dates, and who built the monuments. The story of Ai is the story of that loss, the story of a man who lived through the most extraordinary period in the history of the most extraordinary civilization of the ancient world, and who remains, despite everything we have found and everything we have deciphered, a stranger, a historical figure who is paradoxically both exhaustively documented and completely unknown. The paradox of Ai, the paradox of a man who is documented in the titles and the inscriptions and the tomb decorations, but who is invisible in the personal and the intimate and the morally revealing dimensions of his life, is not merely a limitation of the ancient evidence. It is a fundamental feature of the kind of history that the ancient world has left us. A history of monuments and inscriptions, of official pronouncements and theological declarations, of public acts and ceremonial performances, that captures the surface of historical events with remarkable detail, but that leaves the depths, the motivations, the emotions, the moral calculations, the private doubts and the private ambitions entirely in shadow. The modern study of the Amarna period, the most intensively investigated era in the history of Egyptological research, has made enormous progress in reconstructing the external facts of Ai's career. We know when he served, under whom, in what capacity, and with what titles. We know the sequence of his promotions, the evolution of his responsibilities, and the progression of his influence from the provincial priesthood to the throne of Egypt. We know the buildings he built, the monuments he erected, the ceremonies he performed, and the policies he implemented. What we do not know, what we will never know, is why. Why did he serve the revolution? Why did he manage the restoration? Why did he seize the throne? Why did he attempt to establish a dynasty? The external facts are clear. The internal motivations are invisible. And the gap between the facts and the motivations is the gap that makes Ai not merely a historical figure, but a permanent mystery, a question without an answer, a career without a key, a pharaoh without a soul, at least, without a soul that the historical record has preserved. The human cost of the Amarna period, the cost that is measured not in monuments and inscriptions, but in the lives of the individuals who were caught up in the revolution and its aftermath, is visible, if dimly, in the career of Ai and in the fates of the people who surrounded him. Nefertiti, if she was indeed Ai's daughter, disappeared from the historical record around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, her fate unknown, her body unidentified, her role in the succession crisis that followed Akhenaten's death a matter of scholarly speculation. Ankhesenamun, who may have been A's granddaughter if the identification of A as Nefertiti's father is correct, was forced into a marriage she had desperately tried to prevent and then vanished from the record, her fate as obscure and as tragic as Nefertiti's. Tutankhamun, the boy who may have been Ai's great-nephew, the child whose throne Ai managed and whose tomb Ai sealed, died at 19, broken by disease and genetics, his body more thoroughly known to modern science than his mind will ever be. The family from Akhmim, the provincial nobles who had risen to the pinnacle of the Egyptian state, left behind a trail of extraordinary achievement and extraordinary suffering. Queens, pharaohs, revolution, restoration, marriage, murder, erasure. The family's extraordinary and ultimately tragic story is, in microcosm, the story of the entire late 18th dynasty itself, compressed into 3 generations and culminating in the quiet, systematic, theologically devastating, and historically consequential destruction of Ai's tomb by the military commander who wanted the family and its story forgotten. Let that sink in. We know more about the physical condition of Tutankhamun's body, his clubfoot, his malaria, his bone disease, his broken leg, than we know about the inner life of the man who buried him. We know more about the chemical composition of the pigments on the walls of the tomb than we know about the motivations of the man who ordered the paintings. We know more about the metallurgy of the golden mask than we know about the politics of the man who placed it on the dead king's face. The science advances, the mystery deepens, and the man at the centre of the mystery, the courtier who served the revolution, the advisor who managed the counter-revolution, the pharaoh who seized the throne, and the erased one whose memory was destroyed, recedes further into the silence with every new discovery that fails to illuminate his soul. We have followed Aa from the provincial city of Akhim to the throne of Egypt, from the son of a provincial noble to the most powerful man in the ancient world, from the courtier who received the gold of honor from the heretic Pharaoh to the elderly Pharaoh who was comprehensively and mercilessly erased by his own successor. We have seen the revolution, the Aten theology that Ay served, the great hymn he inscribed, the city of Amarna where he built his tomb. We have seen the restoration, the return to the old gods, the reopening of the temples, the comprehensive reversal of everything the revolution had accomplished. We have seen the secession crisis, the death of the boy king, the desperate letters of the widowed queen, the murder of the Hittite prince, the marriage that sealed the throne. And we have seen the destruction, the smashed sarcophagus, the chiseled walls, the erased name, the damnatio memoriae that removed Ay from the historical record so thoroughly that the king lists of Seti I skip directly from Amenhotep III to Horshemheb, as if the entire Amarna period, Akhenaten, Smenkhkar Tutankhamun I, had never existed. What does this extraordinary and troubling story ultimately mean? It means that the ability to survive does not guarantee the ability to be remembered, and that the most successful political career can be erased as completely as if it had never happened. Ay was, by any measure, one of the most successful political operators in the history of the ancient world. He served under at least 3 pharaohs, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and possibly Amenhotep III. He navigated the most dangerous theological and political upheaval in the history of the Egyptian state. He adapted to the revolution, adapted to the counter-revolution, and emerged from both transformations with his position intact and his influence enhanced. He seized the throne of Egypt, the most powerful state in the ancient world, at an age when most men of his era were already dead. And then, within years of his death, he was erased. His name chiseled from stone, his image hacked from walls, his sarcophagus smashed, his mummy probably destroyed, his place in the official historical record eliminated as if he had never drawn breath. The erasure of Ay teaches us something profound about the nature of power in the ancient world, and, by extension, about the nature of power in any world. Power in ancient Egypt was not merely political, it was theological. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler, he was a god, a divine being, whose existence was sustained by the monuments and the inscriptions and the rituals that preserved his name and his image for eternity. To erase a pharaoh's name was not merely to rewrite history, it was to destroy the pharaoh's soul, to deny him the afterlife that the Egyptian funerary tradition was designed to guarantee, to condemn him to the most terrible, the most universally feared, the most theologically horrifying, and the most theologically devastating fate that the Egyptian theological system could imagine: permanent, irrevocable, and absolute non-existence. Horemheb did not merely remove Ay from the king lists. He tried to remove Ay from eternity. The parallel with the modern world is uncomfortable and instructive. Every political system has its mechanisms for erasing the inconvenient, for removing from the historical record the figures whose existence complicates the narrative that the current regime wishes to tell. The Soviet Union airbrushed its purged officials from photographs. China has erased the memory of Tiananmen Square from its internet. Every civilization, every political system, every regime that has ever exercised power has also exercised the power to determine what is remembered and what is forgotten. And the exercise of that power is never neutral, never innocent, and never without profound consequences for the integrity of the historical record. The erasure of Ay raises a question that is as relevant to the modern world as it is to the ancient, a question about who controls the historical narrative and what happens when the powerful decide that certain chapters of the past are too inconvenient to be remembered. Horemheb erased Ay because Ay's existence complicated the narrative that Horemheb wished to tell, a narrative in which the legitimate succession passed directly from the golden age of Amenhotep III to Horemheb, with no heretics, no boy kings, no elderly courtiers in between. The erasure was structural, a rewriting of the dynasty's history to serve the political needs of the present. The fact that the erasure almost succeeded, that Ay was unknown to the modern world until the systematic and scientifically rigorous archaeological investigation of the Amarna period recovered the evidence that Horemheb had tried to destroy, is one of the most sobering lessons of this story. For more than 3,000 years, the king lists of the Egyptian state recorded the history that Horemheb had written, a sanitized, simplified, politically convenient history in which the troublesome pharaohs of the Amarna period simply did not exist. For the scribes who compiled the king lists under Seti I and Ramesses II, scribes who were working from official records that Horemheb had already purged. The gap between Amenhotep III and Horemheb was simply the way things were. The revolution had not happened, the boy king had not reigned, the old courtier had not seized the throne. The entire period, spanning more than 30 years, encompassing the most radical religious revolution and the most comprehensive religious restoration in the history of the Egyptian state, was simply absent from the official record. The recovery of the Amarna period by 19th and 20th century archaeologists, through the excavation of the city of Amarna, the discovery of the Amarna letters, the identification of the Amarna pharaohs through monuments that Horemheb's agents had missed, or that had been buried too deeply for the erasers to reach, is one of the greatest achievements of modern Egyptology. The recovery demonstrated that the official historical record of the Egyptian state, the king lists, the temple inscriptions, the official chronologies, was not a neutral or comprehensive account of the past, but a politically constructed narrative that reflected the interests of the compilers, the agendas of the current regime, and the ideological requirements of the moment, rather than the full, messy, morally ambiguous, and politically inconvenient complexity of the actual historical events it purported to faithfully and comprehensively describe. The lesson is not unique to ancient Egypt. It is a universal feature of the relationship between power and history, between the present and the past, between the people who hold the chisels and the people whose names are carved in stone. The story of Ai is finally a story about the profound and unsettling fragility of legacy, of reputation, and of historical memory, about the ease with which the achievements of a lifetime can be erased, and the memory of an individual can be destroyed. Ai spent 50 years building his career, accumulating titles, cultivating relationships, navigating theological and political upheavals, positioning himself for the ultimate prize. He achieved the prize, he became Pharaoh, and then, within years of his death, everything he had built was erased, his name chiseled from stone, his image hacked from walls, his sarcophagus smashed, his dynasty destroyed before it could begin, his mummy possibly destroyed, his place in the official historical record eliminated. The erasure was comprehensive. The erasure was deliberate. The erasure was almost permanent. And the man who ordered it, Horemheb, the military commander who had waited patiently through 2 reigns for his chance, went on to rule Egypt for nearly 30 years and to be remembered in the official record as the legitimate successor of Amenhotep III, the man who restored order after the chaos of the Amarna period, the pharaoh who bridged the gap between the 18th and the 19th dynasties, the pharaoh who chose as his successor a military official named Paramess, who would become Ramesses I and who would found the dynasty that produced some of the most famous, most powerful, and most historically consequential pharaohs in the entire subsequent history of the Egyptian state, including Seti I and the great Ramesses II. The irony is that Horemheb's own legacy was itself impermanent, that the military commander who erased Ai was eventually erased himself, not by a successor's chisels but by the slower, more impartial, and more democratic process of historical forgetting. Horemheb is barely better known to the general public than Ai. Both men are footnotes in the popular imagination, overshadowed by the boy king, whose golden mask has captivated the world, and whose fame, a fame built entirely on the accident of his tomb's survival rather than on any personal achievement, dwarfs the combined historical reputations of all the pharaohs, generals, powerful courtiers, ambitious queens, and scheming advisors who served, struggled, maneuvered, and competed for power before and after him during the most turbulent era in the history of the Egyptian state, rather than the full complexity of the events it purported to describe. A history in which I did not exist, in which the most turbulent and most consequential period of the 18th dynasty was simply a blank space. The story of Ai is also a story about the limits of survival as a strategy. Ai survived the Golden Age, the Revolution, the Counter-Revolution, and the Succession Crisis. He survived because he was adaptable, because he could serve the Aten under Akhenaten and Amun under Tutankhamun with equal apparent conviction, because he could navigate the shifting theological and political currents of the most turbulent period in Egyptian history without being swept away by any of them. But survival is not the same as permanence, and the distinction between the two is one of the most important and most often overlooked lessons of ancient history. Survival is a short-term strategy. It is the ability to navigate the immediate crisis, to adapt to the current threat, to maintain one's position through the current upheaval. Permanence is a long-term achievement. It is the ability to establish something that outlasts the individual, that survives the transitions and the upheavals, that endures beyond the lifetime of the person who created it. Ai was a master of survival, but he failed at permanence. He survived the revolution, the counter-revolution, and the succession crisis. He achieved the ultimate goal of his career, the throne of Egypt, but he could not make the achievement last. He could not establish a dynasty. He could not prevent his successor from seizing the throne, and he could not protect his own memory from the chisels and the hammers and the organized bureaucratic machinery of state-sponsored destruction that would obliterate it. The failure of permanence is the defining tragedy of Ai's career, and it is a tragedy that resonates far beyond the specific case of the 18th dynasty pharaoh. Every political figure, every historical actor, every political leader, every historical actor, every ambitious human being who has ever sought to build something lasting, something permanent, something that would survive the builder, has confronted the same fundamental problem: how to ensure that what is built survives the builder. The pharaonic system addressed this problem through the construction of tombs, the inscription of names on imperishable stone, the preservation of physical bodies through the elaborate technology of mummification, and the maintenance of funerary cults. An elaborate, theologically sophisticated, architecturally monumental, and materially intensive system of permanence that was designed to guarantee the eternal survival of the individual's identity and the individual's place in the cosmic order. He participated in this system. He built his tomb, he inscribed his name, he prepared his body for mummification, he established the ritual framework that was supposed to sustain his existence for eternity. And then his successor destroyed it all, smashed the sarcophagus, chiseled the name, erased the image, and left the old pharaoh's body to whatever fate the looters and the centuries would impose. And the man who survived everything that the living world could throw at him was destroyed, comprehensively and almost permanently, by the dead world of the tomb and the deliberately and systematically chiseled stone. The irony is severe. A spent his entire career accumulating the titles, the honors, the connections, and the political capital that would allow him to seize the throne when the opportunity arose. He achieved his goal. He became pharaoh. He ruled for 4 years. And then everything he had built was erased. Not by the passage of time, not by the slow erosion of sand and wind and rain, but by the deliberate, organized, bureaucratically efficient, and politically motivated act of a military commander who resented the old courtier's seizure of the throne, who had been denied the succession that he considered rightfully his, and who was determined to ensure that neither Ai nor his chosen heir would be remembered by the living or by the gods, and who was determined, with the cold, systematic thoroughness of a military commander executing a strategic plan, to ensure that the old courtier's claim to legitimacy, to divine status, and to eternal existence would not survive the old courtier's death. It is late. The western valley of the kings is silent, more silent than the main valley, which echoes with the footsteps of tourists and the voices of guides, even in the darkness. The entrance to WV23 is a dark opening in the rock, unremarkable, unvisited, unlit. A hole in the limestone bedrock that leads, through a series of descending corridors and chambers, to a smashed sarcophagus and a set of painted walls from which the face of the man who was buried there has been systematically and deliberately removed. So here is the answer to the question we began with. Who was I, and what does his story tell us? He was a survivor. He was born a commoner, a man of non-royal blood, a provincial notable from a city that most Egyptians would have considered unremarkable, and he died a pharaoh, a god king, the most powerful individual in the most powerful state in the ancient world. He served at least 3 kings, the golden pharaoh, the heretic pharaoh, and the boy pharaoh, and he outlived them all. He inscribed the most beautiful hymn in the literature of the ancient world on the walls of his tomb, and then oversaw the destruction of the theology it expressed. He performed the most sacred ritual in the Egyptian funerary tradition on the body of a boy king, whose death may or may not have been convenient for his ambitions. He married a young queen who had written desperate letters to a foreign king begging to be saved from the marriage that I intended to impose. He attempted to establish a dynasty, to pass the throne to his chosen heir, to perpetuate the power of the Akhmim family into the next generation, and he failed. The tomb is quiet now. The sarcophagus has been reconstructed from its fragments, pieced together by archaeologists who found the shattered pieces scattered across the burial chamber floor. The paintings on the walls, the hunting and fishing scenes that are unique among royal tombs, the images of the protective goddesses whose arms once cradled the pharaoh's organs, are faded but still visible, still legible to the scholars who descend into the chamber with their cameras and their notebooks and their patient, methodical determination to recover what was lost. The man is gone. His mummy has never been conclusively identified. Fragmentary skeletal remains found in the tomb may be his, or they may belong to someone else. His name was erased so thoroughly that the king lists compiled more than a century after his death do not mention him, do not acknowledge that he ever existed, do not include his name in the sequence of pharaohs that stretches from Menes to the current ruler, do not grant him even the shadow of historical existence that the listing of a name in a chronological record would provide. His monuments were usurped so completely that a casual visitor to the sites he built would never know he had existed. The erasure was almost perfect, almost complete, almost successful, almost permanent. Almost, but not quite, because the erasure, however comprehensive, however systematic, however theologically devastating, was not total. The agents who destroyed I's tomb in the Western Valley did not, could not, reach every monument, every inscription, every trace of the old pharaoh's existence across the vast expanse of the Egyptian empire. And the most important surviving evidence of I's career was located not in the Valley of the Kings, but in the empty, abandoned, sand-covered ruins of the city that Akhenaten had built and that the Egyptian state had left to crumble in the desert, because the tomb at Amarna, the unfinished tomb in the cliffs above the abandoned city, still bears his name. The great hymn to the Teen is still inscribed on its walls, 13 columns of hieroglyphic text that have survived the revolution, the counter-revolution, the erasure, and the 3,000 years of silence that followed. The scenes of I and Tay receiving the gold of honor are still visible, their arms still raised, their faces still turned upward in attitudes of reverence and gratitude toward the pharaoh, who showers them with golden collars and precious ornaments from the window of appearance. The tomb at Amarna escaped the destruction that consumed the tomb in the Valley of the Kings, escaped because the revolutionary city of Amarna was abandoned so early, so abruptly, and so completely that the erasers never bothered to seek out the courtier's tomb in the cliffs above the empty plain. The great hymn survives, the name survives, the mystery survives, and the question that I's career poses, the question of what a man believes when he serves 2 contradictory theologies with equal apparent devotion, of what a man wants when he spends a lifetime accumulating power and then uses it for only 4 brief years, of what a man deserves when he is erased by the successor he could not prevent. The question survives too. It survives because it has no answer, because the man at the center of the mystery left no personal documents, no private letters, no intimate reflections that would illuminate the motivations that drove his extraordinary career and the convictions, theological, political, personal, that sustained him through the most turbulent period in the history of the ancient world. The ancient Egyptians left us their titles, but not their thoughts, their monuments, but not their doubts, their inscriptions, but not their anxieties. The inner life of the ancient Egyptian official, the world of private belief, private ambition, private moral calculation that lay behind the public performance of titles and ceremonies, is lost to us, and the loss is permanent. The papyrus has crumbled. The private thoughts were never written down. The conversations that would have revealed the man behind the titles, the conversations with his wife, his children, his confidants, his gods, were spoken into the air of the 14th century BC and have been dissipating ever since. The loss is not merely frustrating, it is philosophically significant, because it forces us to confront the limits of historical knowledge itself. We devote ourselves to the study of the past in order to understand it, in order to reconstruct the thoughts, the motivations, the moral choices of the people who lived through the events we investigate. But the case of I demonstrates that understanding is not always achievable, that there are historical figures whose external careers are well documented and whose internal lives are permanently and irretrievably beyond our reach. I is such a figure, the most extensively and meticulously well-documented courtier, and simultaneously the most frustratingly opaque and impenetrable pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, a man whose extraordinary and historically unprecedented career is a monument to the remarkable human capacity for adaptability, pragmatic reinvention, and political survival, and whose invisible, unknowable, permanently inaccessible soul is a sobering and philosophically important monument to the fundamental, perhaps insuperable, limits of the historical enterprise. Limits that no amount of excavation, no advances in technology, and no future archaeological discoveries can overcome, because the evidence that would resolve it does not exist and never will, and because the silence of 33 centuries has transformed a political career into a permanent mystery, a historical figure into an eternal question, and a pharaoh into a ghost, and a ghost in the Egyptian theological system into something worse than a ghost, a non-entity, a person who has been denied even the shadowy half-existence that the unburied dead were believed to endure, a soul that has been systematically and deliberately prevented from continuing its journey through the afterlife by the destruction of the name, the image, and the body that the Egyptian funerary tradition required for the survival of the individual beyond the grave. The final irony. The irony that makes I's story not merely a political narrative, but a philosophical meditation on the nature of memory, power, and the universal and deeply human desire for permanence, for legacy, and for the survival of the individual identity beyond the boundaries of biological death, is that the erasure failed. Not entirely, not yet, but enough. Enough for the archaeologists to recover the evidence, enough for the scholars to reconstruct the career, enough for the name to survive, inscribed on the walls of a tomb in an abandoned city, written in the archives of a defeated empire, preserved in the fragments of a shattered sarcophagus that a man from Padua found in the darkness of the Western Valley 200 years ago. The erasure failed because erasure always fails in the end, because the evidence, buried in the sand, inscribed on abandoned walls, preserved in foreign archives, is always more durable than the political power that tries to destroy it, because the truth is always more patient than the lie that tries to replace it, and because the archaeological enterprise, that patient, methodical, endlessly curious enterprise of digging into the earth and recovering what the powerful tried to bury, is, in its own quiet way, the most powerful instrument of justice that the human species has ever devised. The desert covers everything, eventually, inevitably, impartially. The wind erases everything. The inscriptions, the paintings, the carved names that the pharaohs believed would preserve their identities for eternity. The sand buries everything. The temples, the cities, the tombs, the monuments, the entire extraordinary material apparatus of a civilization that devoted more of its resources to the defeat of death than any other civilization in the history of the human species. And beneath the sand, beneath the rubble, beneath the silence, beneath the weight of 33 centuries of erasure and forgetting, the evidence waits. It waits for the archaeologists who will eventually come with their trowels and their brushes and their cameras and their patient, methodical determination to recover what the powerful tried to destroy. It waits for the scholars who will read the surviving inscriptions and piece together, from fragments and hints and absences, the outline of a career that was almost erased from the historical record. It waits for the questions that cannot be answered, the questions about belief and motivation and moral responsibility that the evidence raises but cannot resolve. But the evidence itself, fragmentary, ambiguous, incomplete, and compromised by 3,000 years of erasure and forgetting, is, in its own way, sufficient. It is sufficient to tell us that a man named I existed, that he was born in Akhmim, that he served at the courts of pharaohs, that he witnessed the revolution and managed the restoration, that he buried a boy king and married a young queen and seized the throne of the most powerful state in the ancient world. It is sufficient to tell us that his achievement was extraordinary, that a commoner from an obscure provincial city in Upper Egypt could, through 5 decades of patient service, calculated adaptation, strategic marriage, political maneuvering, and the exploitation of successive crises, rise from the local priesthood of a fertility god to the position of god-king, divine ruler, lord of the two lands, ruler of Egypt, lord of the two lands, and it is sufficient to tell us that his achievement was impermanent, that the throne he seized was held for only 4 years, that the dynasty he attempted to establish was destroyed before it could begin, and that the memory he tried to preserve was shattered, along with his sarcophagus, by the man who came after him. The math is striking. I served the Egyptian state for approximately 50 years, across the golden age of Amenhotep III, the revolution of Akhenaten, the restoration of Tutankhamun, and his own brief reign. He held the throne for approximately 4 years. He was remembered for approximately 0 years. His name erased, his image destroyed, his place in the king lists eliminated, his existence unknown to the modern world, until the archaeological investigation of the 19th and 20th centuries recovered the evidence that Horemheb had tried to destroy. 50 years of patient, adaptable, politically skillful service. 4 years of hard-won, contested and precarious power. 3,000 years of enforced, deliberate and almost successful silence. And then, slowly, painstakingly, fragment by fragment, the recovery of a man who the most powerful state in the ancient world had tried to make disappear. But somewhere in the Western Valley, in that quiet, empty, unvisited branch of the royal necropolis, a red granite sarcophagus sits in the darkness, reconstructed from its fragments, empty of the body it was built to hold, bearing on its surfaces the images of goddesses whose arms still reach out, protectively, toward a space that has been vacant for more than 33 centuries. The goddesses are still there. The protection they offer is still carved in stone. But the man they were meant to protect is gone. Erased from the walls, erased from the king lists, erased from the afterlife itself. And whether he deserved the erasure, whether the old courtier who seized the throne and married the queen and buried the boy king earned the destruction that his successor inflicted, is a question that the smashed sarcophagus and the chiseled walls, the absent mummy and the silent, dark, empty and profoundly melancholy tomb will never and can never answer.